Hey guys, thank you very much for joining me. And we're carrying on today with looking at Thatcher's economic policy. And we're going to focus on the final 3 parts here. We're going to look at inflation, unemployment, and what's described as economic realignment. Now, the first thing we need to do with this phrase, the new right, you've looked at it before, but we need to be clear in what this means before we're going to move on to the rest of the lesson. Now, you can see in front of you, it's a collective name for a number of organisations who challenged Keynesian theory. So this new right includes organisations such as the Centre for Policy Studies and the Adam Smith Institute. They're looking at different ways of managing the economy. They want to move away from Keynesian theory and they want to move towards a monetarist theory, for economic management, economic development. And they promote this idea of free market economics. So it's less government intervention and individuals being encouraged to take more responsibility for their actions. So think back to previous lessons we've looked at. Think about the lesson about monetarism, deregulation and privatisation, and how all of these ideas connect with the theories of the new right. Now, the new right are blaming Keynesian economic theory for allowing inflation to rise. They argue that if inflation is controlled, the economy will grow. The economy will succeed if we control inflation. And don't forget, this idea of inflation, it's prices rising over a period of time. So at the moment, in June 2020, inflation stands about 2%. So that means that over the course of a year, prices will rise by 2%. And Thatcher feels that if we control inflation, the economy will grow. Now let's just look at that. Let's compare and contrast that. So the post-war consensus, economic theory then was very much Keynesian economic theory, lots of government intervention and controlling unemployment. That was the main thing, as close to full employment as possible. But then we have the new right, and that moves on to monetarist economic theory. A free market, so reduced government intervention, and rather than controlling unemployment, we're now going to look at controlling inflation instead. So let's have a look at the 3 key parts we talked about for this lesson. The first thing we're going to look at is controlling inflation. Now, Margaret Thatcher uses interest rates as the way to control inflation. A higher interest rate means you're encouraged to save your money rather than spend it. If you've got £100 and you keep it in the bank where there's an interest rate of 10%, at the end of the year, you'll have £110. So you're going to want to keep your money saving it because you know it's going to grow in value. Higher interest rates also deter people from borrowing money for purchases. So let's say you want to borrow £100 to buy something. In the most basic terms, at the end of the year, you'll have to pay £110 back. So you don't want to borrow money instead. So higher interest rates mean that people don't spend as much money, and it reduces the amount of money in the economy because people are saving more. However, this idea of higher interest rates not only makes it more expensive for you as a shopper to borrow money, it makes it more expensive for industry to borrow money. So if a factory owner wants to borrow money to build a new factory or to buy new machinery, they can't afford to because the interest rate is too high. So it prevents industries growing. It prevents businesses growing. Also, the interest rate actually increases the value of the pound, because if you save more pounds, you're going to get more money. People want to buy pounds. Foreign investors want to buy pounds, and so the value of them goes up. But that makes it more difficult for businesses to export, because when you're exporting something from Britain and the cost is in pounds, all of a sudden things have become more expensive. So higher interest rates are bad for business. They're bad because businesses can't borrow money, and they're bad because businesses find it more difficult to export goods. Now, back in 1979, the interest rate is at 17%. This leads to a decline in the demand for goods. People don't want to buy things. They can't afford to. They want to save their money. And there's also a decline in production. If people aren't buying something, factories aren't going to be making it. And the economy went into recession. Businesses started going bankrupt. And unemployment started rising. However, for Margaret Thatcher, that is really not going to be an issue. She's more focused on controlling inflation at this point. However, inflation remains high, and it's reaching 22% by May 1980. So that means if you buy something and it's £100, the following year it would cost you £122 for the same thing. Everything is going up in value, up in price all the time. Now inflation does drop. It drops to 5.1% by 1983. But you get this idea that unemployment is rising and inflation at some stage actually is quite high still. So you need to consider, has Margaret Thatcher achieved what she wanted to achieve? I've given you a graph in front of you now just to look at, and I've taken you all the way back to 1960. I've done that deliberately so you can have a look at the period of post-war consensus as well. You can see the end of the Conservative government in the 1960s. You can see it all the way through Wilson, Callaghan, Heath, all the way through to 1979. And you can see how inflation changes. And then we see this spike. That spike's round about the time Margaret Thatcher's in power. It occurs before, but it certainly doesn't drop suddenly when she takes over. So a question to consider: has Margaret Thatcher been successful in controlling inflation? Next thing we need to look at is unemployment. Now don't forget, post-war consensus was very much focused on trying to attain full employment, which would generally mean only about 1% of the workforce would be unemployed at any one time. Now Margaret Thatcher doesn't consider low employment to be a primary aim. Her priority is low inflation. So she accepts that for industry to be competitive, some people are going to have to be made unemployed. That's just the nature of employment for her. If business A wants to compete against business B, and the way they can do that is by having less workers, therefore paying less wages, then so be it. That is how business works. There is an issue though. Some areas are hit really badly due to industrial plants closing. So we see the Midlands, Northern England, South Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all hit with higher levels of unemployment when Margaret Thatcher takes over. This is because a lot of the industry in these regions has been based on old technology, older ways of doing business, older ways of working, and Margaret Thatcher says, well, we've got to move on. And if that means those people are being made unemployed, that's life. What we end up with is by 1983, we've got 3 million people unemployed. It is the highest level it has been since World War II. Some people suggest it's actually closer to 4 million because not everybody registered for unemployment benefits. But the recorded figure is 3 million people are unemployed. Now, to try and reduce that figure, the government introduced youth training schemes. And the idea was that employers would take on young people. They would get paid fractionally more than unemployment benefit. And the employer wouldn't have to pay them much at all. But it would mean that they're no longer classed as unemployed, so it reduces the unemployment figures. However, these jobs are unskilled and they're low paid. So not often were people getting a qualification at the end of it. In some areas, such as Liverpool, which had relied heavily on manufacturing and what's described as heavy industry, unemployment reaches 25%. And many skilled workers find themselves out of work due to mechanicization. Essentially, businesses are using robots, are using different ways of making things that no longer need that same level of workforce. You find it hits men harder. There are men being made unemployed more than women are. Women are working in what essentially have been described as low-paid jobs, cleaning, clerical work, things like that. And they weren't being made unemployed to the same degree. And so what happened is women became the main earner in many homes. Now you need to think back to the attitudes of that time as well. They're very different to the attitudes today. But a lot of men in the 1980s found that really difficult to deal with. Their pride was hurt. No longer were they the main bread earner. No longer were they bringing home the wage. A good example to see that, if you watch the film The Full Monty, there's a character in that film who's been made unemployed. And he goes through this facade of putting on his suit every day, going out the house, because he doesn't want his wife to know that actually he's now unemployed. And it was causing real shame for men at that time. Quite often a good way for historians, and for you as historians here, to get an idea of how an event affects society is to sometimes look at the social commentary for that period. And in 1982, an award-winning drama was aired on BBC. It was known as Boys from the Black Stuff. It was essentially a sequel from a play. The Black Stuff was about a factory which had closed and a number of people had been made unemployed. And Boys from the Black Stuff was the follow-on from that. And it's the story of 5 men in Liverpool. And it shows the difficulties they go through. There's a character who, if you'd seen it at the time, everybody would have known. He was known as Yozza Hughes. And he had this phrase, "Gives a job." And it became a phrase that everybody knew at the time. And it really does sum up that period. So, if you want to understand it slightly wider, I would suggest you try and watch that. There are clips from it on YouTube. You can get the full series on Amazon, but it is certainly worth a watch just to develop your wider understanding. I've finally given you unemployment figures over that period. On the chart in front of you, it is from the ONS. Hopefully you do now know what that means, the Office of National Statistics. That's a government office. We can trust these figures. And the period that's in white on that graph is the period when Margaret Thatcher is in power. And we can see that rise. We can see it going up to 3 million, and then it slowly starts to drop away at the end. But that rise in unemployment really is going to affect social conditions for people. Then finally, I want to look at this idea of economic realignment. This phrase sounds quite complicated, to be honest. It's like, yeah, it's going to be a tricky one to understand. But actually it isn't. Economic realignment is quite a simple thing to figure out. So I'm going to show you a photograph. Car production, 1979. The iconic Mini. It's been built. We can see what appears to be a manager on the left-hand side in his suit walking along, and all the workers are busy building Minis. It's 1979. I'm now going to show you a picture from car production in the 1980s. There's a vast difference. Now this picture is at an extreme end of the spectrum, but you can see how all of a sudden unemployment is going to rise. Previously, you've had lots of people involved in building cars, and now all of a sudden there are less people. It's become a lot more automated. That doesn't just mean that the people working on the production line aren't earning a wage anymore. Those people on the production line no doubt went to the local cafe to get their lunch, went to the local shops to spend their wages, but now they've been made unemployed. They can't go to the cafe, they can't go to the shops, so these other industries are going to suffer as well. Another example here is mining. Now we're going to look at mines and miners later on when we look at the miners' strike again. But in 1979, you've got miners being a key part of the economy. Coal-fired power stations are essential for this country. Yet in the 1980s, we suddenly find we've got North Sea oil online, which essentially means we're getting oil, we're getting gas from the North Sea. And they are now powering power stations, they are powering industry. And it means that coal is no longer in the same level of demand. So if you were a miner, all of a sudden you're going to find that you're at a high chance of being made unemployed. So economic realignment. Older, labour-intensive industries, they're now facing competition from cheaper imports and the use of new technology. People were finding it was cheaper to make cars overseas and import them into Britain than it was to actually make them in Britain. Steel was being produced overseas cheaper than it was to make steel in this country. And it was meaning that people who worked in these industries were out of work. The British economy starts to move away from heavy industry, this idea of building cars, of producing steel, of coal mining, and moves to what's called the service sector, so banking, finance. The simplest way to describe it for me would be desk jobs. And you find that these men who have worked years in heavy industry are out of work. And we have this idea of the North-South Divide, and hostility to the government grows. The North-South Divide has been there before. You could look back to the 1920s and the 1930s and the Jarrow marches, but it becomes really, really evident in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And poverty is seen as a significant cause of the riots. So when we looked at Brixton riots, we looked at Toxteth riots, and we looked at those earlier on when we looked at how Thatcher had managed to win the 1983 election. The riots that we looked at, poverty is a significant factor at that time. Now, Geoffrey Howe, he's a dry. He argues for a managed decline of these areas. Almost it is what it is. We're not going to try and help them. We're just going to manage their decline, allow them to die off. Michael Heseltine, another member of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, however, he's a wet. He believes that government intervention is really important for areas, and therefore he promotes the idea of places like Albert Dock in Liverpool being regenerated. And at one point you had Liverpool, you had the Garden City being created, and there was a big festival and people went to visit. But the whole of the Albert Dock complex pretty much could be argued is down to Michael Heseltine, arguing for a lot of investment to be put into Liverpool. So let's have a quick summary then of how this economic alignment affected Britain. You've got steel workers, and we can see how the number of jobs declines over that period. This is great evidence to be using in your essays and whenever you're looking at sources. I've shown you coal miners as well. I am going to caveat that we are going to be talking about a miners' strike later on, so that will change the situation as well. And then car production. You can see how car production declines in Great Britain throughout this period. And then in 1986, Nissan opened a factory in Sunderland. Now that sounds fantastic. A car factory being opened. So that's going to employ lots of people. But don't forget, it's going to be automated. There are going to be robots there as well. So it's not going to employ the same number of people as car factories had employed in the 1970s. So your assignment, rather than writing an essay, rather than analysing a source, I want you to really think about what this period would have been like if you were living through it. So I want you to write it from 3 different perspectives. I want you to explain your view of the changes if you'd have been a factory worker in Scotland, essentially a factory worker in the north of the country. How would you have felt about economic realignment? How would that have affected you? What would have happened to those around you? What would have happened to your family? I then want you to write from the perspective of a stockbroker in London. Now you're going to need to refer to other lessons here, particularly deregulation for this one. How do you feel when the Big Bang takes place? When all of a sudden there's more investment taking place in London and there's those opportunities for you to make a lot of money. I want you to write about that, but I also want you to think about what would your view be about people in the north being made unemployed. It might be worth trying to take the perspective that Geoffrey Howe took. Think about that. And then finally, I want you to write from the perspective as a young person in Liverpool. Now I'm thinking probably somebody about your age, to be honest. So if you're doing your A-levels now, which ideally you are if you're in my class, so you're going to be somewhere between the ages of 16 through to 18, I want you to be writing from that perspective. What do you think your opportunities are like? What have the government offered you instead? Do you think that's fair? How do you feel about this North-South divide? Now I'm looking for at least half a page of each 4, on each person. But the more you add, the more detail you add, the more it will allow this to be set in your thinking. You'll understand it better. So really put some time and effort into this one. Now, some wider reading. I've talked about Boys from the Black stuff. You've got to buy that one, unfortunately, if you want to see it all. However, these 3 articles you can get online. I will send you links to them directly, and you can get some idea of what society was like in that period, and also it will help add some extra information to your notes. Don't just use this though. Go out there and find some wider reading yourself. Andrew Moore is obviously an obvious one to go to if you've got that book already, but have a look around. See what else you can find. If you've got any questions, by all means get in touch. Otherwise, look forward to seeing your work. Thanks very much.